Okay. Uh, Hi, everyone. This conversation is with Gary Mander. Gary is a seasoned procurement expert with over 20 years of experience. He is currently working as a senior manager in EY Ireland's procurement advisory division. While Gary advises firms on SAP products and other procurement systems, his core interests are in process consulting side, continuous improvement for procurement as a function, and procurement laws, policies, and regulation. With that, welcome, Gary. Thank you for coming to my podcast to have this
No,
conversation.
listen, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's always great to have an opportunity to be able to kind of maybe give off some of the experiences that I've kind of built up over the last 20 years, as you say. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And before, Gary, before we jump into the topics I wanted to cover with you today, I just wanted to spell out why I approached you and to have this conversation. Because my background is on the system side, right? And I think most of the folks with whom I'm connected in LinkedIn and people who hopefully watch this podcast would be from that kind of category who are focused on SAP systems or other kind of competing procurement systems. What I have observed in last, my own 10, 12 years of experience, that we as system practitioner, we kind of champion the cause of, whether you say clean core, fit to standard, and all those kind of really procurement practitioner can, that we speak about. Where I have seen some of us found lacking is to really preempt and really understand the procurement point of view. So, we as system practitioner, when we grow up in our function and responsibility, we end up speaking with a lot of procurement executives, and then there is this challenge, right? Because we are too much invested sometimes on the system side and system practices. There is a kind of lack of understanding around that procurement mindset. Where are those some of the questions coming in? What are some of the concerns coming in? So you, with your writings, especially in LinkedIn, what I found is it really strikes me because you really simplify those, that part, right? Because you are coming from substantial years of experience on the procurement side, public procurement side, you are able to really write things in a way that is really easy to grasp, and I'm sure that is going to it is going to really help a lot of system folks. I encourage a lot of my system connections, people who are from the system side, SAP consultants, other system practitioner, to go to your profile and go through the writings you have posted in last many years, and especially recently some of the public procurement tips as part of your 30-day public procurement tips initiative. So uh, thanks for, like I said, yeah, I really admire your creations, your writings. So thanks for doing this.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I think you've kind of framed it quite well because I've come from a background where when I started in procurement, there were no systems. And in hindsight now, looking back, that was a greenfield site that could have been used to really drive and structure a best in class procurement function. But we lacked two things. One, budget. We had no budget to be able to implement systems. Plus, systems were kind of a little bit immature in their kind of their rollout. But secondly, and probably the biggest area that we had was that there was a big focus on just procurement compliance and kind of value for money, adding value to the business. They were all kind of secondary considerations. So in hindsight, we probably could have done a lot more, but we did definitely over the last maybe 15, maybe 10 or 15 years made huge strides, and only from working closely with systems people, because I have seen the other side where there's a misalignment between what systems are trying to do and procurement are trying to do, and it ends up in a kind of a failed initiative, and the business, the people who actually really matter, look from the outside in and say, guys, what's going on here? You haven't really done anything for me. So yeah, no, you've framed that really, really well. So hopefully I can impart some of my experience and some of my kind of what I've learned over the years to your listeners.
Absolutely. Just to start with, Gary, from from people who would like to listen to you, is there any kind of major difference or similarity when we say private procurement versus public procurement, I think the initial assumption would be that public procurement means the kind of initiatives going on the public sector companies. But are there key kind of highlights that you want to focus on for
Yeah, so
people to
like
really, yeah,
yeah, no, it's really a super question, and it's something that I do speak a lot about, with colleagues, with kind of clients, etc. So, like fundamentally, public procurement and private procurement are doing the same thing. They're bringing in goods and services to make the business work. That's fundamentally what it is. But there are obviously differences, and one of the big differences is that because in the public sector you're spending taxpayers' money, there's a higher level of probity and kind of rules and regulations and policies and procedures that would sit above that. The issue that I have in that space is that they effectively get in the way of the buyer trying to buy the goods and services that are needed to bring into the kind of company. And what can happen in organizations is that the size of the procurement organization has to be bigger in the public sector because it's a more of a bureaucratic in inverted commas, and I don't really like using that word kind of wholesalely, but it is slightly more kind of bureaucratic than the private sector. But if you strip down the rules and the procedures, fundamentally it's a person trying to buy goods and services from the market to let the business function and to generate revenue, and that's as simple as it is. So yeah, they will be the big takeaways for me. Very little difference other than maybe the size of the organizations, which, as I say, is a byproduct of the fact that there's just more rules that have to be kind of negotiated.
and building on that, do you see as part now that you are part of UI consulting and you are also looking into the system side, SAP offerings, other systems, Coupa, Evalua, there are so many new tools and startup kind of companies on the procurement system side. Do you
Sure.
see a kind of trend or the way of looking into the system from these companies?
Yeah, so the trend, the only trend that I can see is that organizations get to a certain kind of phase in their kind of their evolution where they decide that they need to start bringing in some procurement technology. Now that could be on the back of just getting to a certain size and getting to that critical mass where it's worth making the investment, or organizations just see this from a perspective of they don't have any processes in place. They want to, invest and make a kind of a good shape on their own procurement policies and procedures and kind of how the systems work, and they reach out to organizations to see can they kind of advise them. But like our advisory practice will be on the basis of developing a roadmap. Like if somebody rang me and gave me a 5-minute introduction as to their operations, I would never turn around and say what you need to do is implement X or you need
Mm,
to go out and purchase Y. It's a long journey, as you will know, and you only make those decisions at the end of really understanding, taking a proper look under the hood as to how does the business function, what is it that they're trying to achieve, and what sort of budget and timescale that they've kind of got. So that'd be the kind of the trend that I would say. It's very rarely people would come to me and say, Gary, we want to implement X, can you help us? That's a conversation that happens kind of way, way, way down the line.
absolutely. And I think when you are, mentioning that some time back, you wrote an article, it's called Eclipse, around procurement organization practices. You clearly called out compliance, org size, efficiency. Do you want to kind of recall that article and just put it
Yeah,
in
no, sure,
context?
I do. And look, tail spend is something that I'm quite close to. I've written about it extensively. I've kind of approached tail spend from a number of different angles. But fundamentally, when I started out on my procurement journey, I was brought in to set up a purchasing function for a large organization, the organization that I worked for, with a purpose of maybe improving procurement compliance. Because any organization of a certain size, if there's no kind of formal contracts in place for routinely purchase goods and services, you basically end up with a bit of an eyesore, as I call them, from a procurement compliance perspective. So really, I was asked to approach setting up the function from a procurement compliance perspective. But one of the benefits of improving procurement compliance in the public sector is that you can aggregate and you can bring requirements together and you can kind of leverage the expenditure that you actually have. But when I contrast that with the private sector, maybe back 15 years ago, private sector organizations would have ginormous tails in their tail spend,
Mm,
but they wouldn't necessarily be as concerned about bringing it into procurement compliance. Because I say earlier on, the rules in private sector procurement are far less onerous than they are in public sector procurement. So if you're spending €4 million, without any formal contracts in the private sector, is there lost opportunities to aggregate and get better value? Yes, there is. Of course there is. But there's no immediate pressure to fix that unless somebody makes a kind of a conscious decision internally to do it. Now what's happening is that we've now what I've called the democratization of technology. Technology is now coming in and filling that gap between, on the one hand, having to have lots of staff to procure, your routine goods and services. Now that can be very much automated, and now the private sector are able to capitalize on that, and they're now going to enjoy the same cost benefits, the same kind of aggregation opportunity as the public sector. But it's technology that's driving that. 20 years ago, that technology didn't exist, and therefore you ended up just with these kind of big tails. But I am seeing generally in the marketplace, private sector organizations are now using technology to be able to manage their tail spend. And I think what happens there is that there's now a convergence between private sector and public sector procurement, that they're going to be moving kind of closer together in the public sector. And I really hope this happens. And I only wrote about it there recently, that if technology can be implemented in a public sector scenario, I would like to think that that would free up resources to be able to move those procurement resources into more strategic activities rather than lowering headcount. Because I think if it's a lowering headcount exercise, it's going to be a fail.
Thank you. And on the headcount part, I just saw one of your posts yesterday. We will touch upon that. But on the Dell spend topic, I think recently, as part of your public procurement tips for the entire month, you posted a great flow chart. I'll of course put that a link to that post directly as part of this video description.
Okay.
But I saw that, and that was really a great methodology or practice that how can you decide what tail spend is, and how probably that gives a idea to a lot of organization, a kind of a way through how they start looking into the spend, how they can really manage. Like, do you want to kind of just talk about the chart itself a bit?
Yeah. So I suppose from my perspective, I come from an engineering background, and us engineers like structure. We like kind of logic. We like kind of stuff like that. And if you look into an organization who have no procedures in place to manage their tail spend, it's actually quite intimidating when you look into the ERP system and see, hundreds of thousands of line items for different kind of goods and services, and you don't know how they align. The only way from a kind of a practical perspective to manage that is to start putting some rules in place. Don't kind of rule by exception. Have a set of rules. Rules can change over time, that's fine. But initially, have a set of rules. So you would ask yourself the first question: what is my internal threshold where I'm forced to go off and have a competitive procurement
Mhm.
process, either it's
Yeah.
tendering or whatever. In my former organization, it was €50,000. That has now gone up to €125,000. That's it. So that's where you start. You say, if I'm going to buy routine goods and services over a set period of time that's going to exceed that figure, I am now going to go and tender. But what you need to do is you need to get the kind of the tactical buyers who are part of these organizations to be able to understand the fabric of the rules that are being implemented. And what I mean by that is that if somebody comes to you and says, I want to buy a laptop, and the
Yeah.
laptop is €1,000, for argument's sake, the question you would ask yourself is, what's the likelihood of somebody's going to also want a laptop over the next short period of time? It's hard to say, isn't it? It will depend on kind of, business kind of requirements, etc., etc. But if somebody came to me and said they wanted to buy I don't know, 1,000 liters of paint, and I asked the question, well, what's that paint for? And they say, well, I want to paint the floors in one of our maintenance depots. I legitimately then will say, well, what's the likelihood of other people in other depots wanting to paint their floor? And now you're having a conversation about speaking with all of the depots to try and pull all of those requirements together. So that's the whole concept of having the flow chart. But when I developed that flow chart, and that is a flow chart that I used in my previous employment, is that I wanted to be able to demonstrate to internal audit and external audit that I have a process in place to manage it. I can't, fight every battle simultaneously. I won't get anything done. But in my first pass, this is what I'm going to do. And by implementing set processes and procedures in line with that flow chart over a period of 12, 18 months, you'd be very surprised at the amount of actual expenditure you can move from the tail into managed agreements. And I think without having some sort of a kind of a methodology, I think you'll always struggle. So I would highly recommend anybody who's in the space where they're looking to manage tail spend is put some rules in place and just follow those rules.
Thank you. I think, yeah, that flowchart really makes a strong fundamental from where you can really build on managing tailspin. So yeah, that would be great for a lot of system folks to look at that and incorporate that as part of their kind of advisory practice. So that's great. I think one of the items that we spoke earlier when we had initial conversation is around this category management topic, right? And I think on the recent past, you have had the opportunity to really look at a lot of category management, new age tools and offerings, SAP, and I'm sure you have seen other offerings also. What I saw as part of your experience is you are into category management 15, 16 years ago. It's been since 2008, 9 is where, at least from your LinkedIn experience, I see that you are into category management. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you see these new tools, right, in 2023, 2024 versus how things were done in the past? And what was kind of lacking really from a process and system point of view? And what you see now, does it really fill that gap? Does it, from a system point of view, is there a value proposition there, or it's just a lot of noise and kind of quality is still remains the same in that sense?
No, again, it's a really, really great question. So yeah, so when I did my master's degree, category management was only really starting to become a phrase that you would kind of regularly hear within kind of procurement circles. And I did my master's degree back in 2010, so that's 14 years ago now at this stage. So what was category management back then? Well, it was a bit of it was a methodology. It was a kind of an acceptance that for procurement to bring their output to the next level, there needed to be more a strategic approach to how goods and services were procured. Now, I did my master's degree in strategic procurement, so you can imagine
Mm.
an element of that was category management, and it was the kind of the more below the line areas of procurement that weren't talked about, certainly with people I was kind of dealing with at the time. So like proper supplier relationship management, entering into kind of deep supplier relationships, understanding how markets operate, proper demand planning, all of these things that are fundamental to the performance of a procurement department, but were invisible, practically invisible 15 years ago.
Mm.
So what I've seen is huge strides and huge steps being made towards the rollout of proper category management. But at the same time, I do feel that there's a lot of organizations who aren't implementing category management. I think if you are a procurement manager and one day somebody decides within the organization, we're going to introduce category management, I'm now giving you a new job title, you're now a category manager. That doesn't change anything. You know, you're
Yeah.
still a procurement manager managing a portfolio of kind of products. Maybe it's the case that you were already doing category management, but you just didn't have the title of category manager. And I think that's the big um, variance that we have out there. There's people who are doing it really well. There's people who are only really starting off doing it. And there's actually, unfortunately, some people who think they're doing it, but they're absolutely not. And the biggest bugbear of mine is that each organization is different. You know, like a category manager in a public sector organization who's procuring, say, ICT equipment, their portfolio of goods and services that they buy are completely different than maybe a pharma industry in the private sector. But the
Mm.
tools that they would use would be the same effectively. So aggregation will get you so far. You know, you'll get XY savings from that, but you'll hit the wall then, and you won't be able to kind of move on from there. And what happens then is that inflationary kind of pressures bring the price that you're paying upwards. So effectively, it's not even that you're standing still, you're actually kind of going backwards. And I think the beauty of category management is being able to unlock additional savings above and beyond the usual traditional stuff you'd hear of, you know, aggregation, negotiation. Like they'll get you so far. But if you really want to unlock the additional savings, you need to be far more strategic and a lot more clever about what way you do that. That's where I see category management now. But if you think about it, if you're just raw looking into your data in an ERP system, you won't be able to extract all of that good stuff that you're going to need to bring it to the next level. This is
Yeah.
now where you need third-party service providers or products that are specifically aligned with category management. So for example, that are actually able to give you predictive analysis about future demand. You won't get that from a standard ERP system. You'll see trends possibly, but you know yourself that if you have bought something in the past 12 months, you've absolutely no way of knowing that you're going to be buying that in the next 12 months. But if your ERP system is looking at the production planning system and can give you a kind of a 6-12 month heads up as to what potentially is coming down the road, that's better data. But I just don't think necessarily, certainly people in a manufacturing context, they just don't have the easy availability of that kind of data. And this is where I think the new sets of tools that are coming down will certainly be a game changer in that respect.
Thank you. And do you see is there, the recent events around COVID and um, war in Europe and instability in other areas? So there is, in a sense, there is for a lot of companies there is a clear need to find more and more in a supplier base to really look into markets which they were not traditionally looking into. And do you see then values for these additional services as part of this category management tool, market analysis insight that really brings that additional value for
Sure.
companies?
No, I guess I do. And again, it heavily depends on your operation. So if we think of, let's say, the Kralchek matrix, okay, and if you have a certain piece of equipment or certain goods that you buy that are absolutely strategically important to the functioning of your organization, you're going to treat them differently. And if up to now you're relying on a very just in time, well kind of oiled supply chain to be able to get the goods to you when you need them, those days are kind of over now, and people realize how exposed they potentially are to kind of things that can happen, without even having any kind of forewarning. And companies are changing their strategies now. So I'm seeing a lot of kind of disaggregation in certain strategic pieces of kind of materials that they need for their organizations, as in they're looking for, multiple sources of supply in
Yeah,
different parts of the world to be able to kind of maintain that. There's a lot of nearshoring going on. I think organizations now realize that if I have a container, if I have a container on a big ship coming over from China, what happens if that gets stuck for 5, 10, 15 weeks, which you've seen a number of
yeah,
instances now that can actually happen. So people are looking at these things slightly differently now. But I don't believe that procurement technology is needed to be able to understand what are the key goods and
yeah,
services that I buy to make my organization work better. And I'd even take that a step further, that a lot of noise again that I hear talks about the actual sourcing process. And in fact, I only seen it on a webcast there last week. I was just watching it. I had a day off and I was just watching a podcast. And the individual said that how difficult it can be for procurement to find suppliers for products. And I kind of shook my head and I didn't understand that, because we have Google, we have the internet. I would be very surprised if I found any procurement person who told me I've been asked to buy this and I don't know where to buy that from. Again, I don't see technology changing the really world there either. But if I have identified a product that's a little bit niche and I do need a bit of an assistance in understanding what the market dynamics of that are, definitely technology can come into play there. One of the modules in my master's degree was to pick any goods or services that the company who we worked for at the time, and then do a proper market analysis on that. And I did a market analysis on the provision of or the supply of wheels and axles for the railway industry. And it was very,
impressive.
very interesting, because I had to go and I had to reach out and get annual reports from organizations. I needed to understand our cumulative requirements, how big were they in respect to all of the markets kind of turnover, where we a kind of a problem organization that companies didn't want to deal with. How could we possibly change our manufacturing processes and information sharing to make us more attractive? I had never gone into that level of detail before as part of any exercise, but it unlocked so much additional value. But it was an awful resource heavy activity that I did.
Can
So
imagine.
technology, this is where technology comes in now. If you can get access to this information in a much more expedient manner, it'll make
Yeah,
all of your procurement decisions much more straightforward and much more kind of streamlined.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Gary. I think as part of your this answer, initially you mentioned about how for individual organization, or at least business kind of function the organization belongs to, the best in class or the kind of the key performance indicator looks different. I think one of your posts in the recent past was around what best in class procurement is and how one should view it beyond the kind of defined KPIs and numbers and so on. Do you want to kind of expand on that, Gary?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think it's universally understood that whilst we're all procuring goods and services on behalf of our organizations, the sector, the industry, the size will really dictate differences between how we actually achieve things. So if I'm working for a relatively small public sector organization that compliance is everything, I can't then say that the best in class procurement is to be procurement compliant on every cent that's paid, because that may be completely different to an SME in the private sector. They might have
Mm.
different objectives. So you can only be best in class in your particular organization. And I don't think it would be right to be extolling virtues of, do what I do and this will work in every organization. It absolutely won't, fundamentally. There are organizations, for argument's sake, who don't really mind the cost of the goods and services that they buy. All they're really interested in is that they've got quality. That's what's really
Yeah,
important to them, and actual ability to be able to get the goods and services when they need them. But other organizations don't work like that. Some organizations don't really mind. They'll, take whatever is available in the market. So I would always be cautious of people reading, one side of the story and say that that person is offering best in class procurement. It's not. You can only be best in class in your organization. That's all you can do. And you need to take the steer from, if you're in a large organization, if there's a, I don't know, board of directors, or there's some sort of an overarching set of objectives, and you align with those objectives. If you're trying to overlay somebody else's best in class over yours and it's not aligned, it's just going to end up in kind of confrontation, bad procurement outcomes, stagnation, difficulties, and ultimately bad procurement. So I think for me, that's what's really important. Do what you do and do what you do best. Find the best tools, the tools that will work for you. Don't try and think you can take somebody else's technology that work for them and it will work for you. It absolutely won't.
thank you. Yeah. As part of my engagement in the past with a lot of companies and even currently with procurement leaders, and a lot of times we hear about this best in class, and there are some numbers around savings, cycle time, and so on. Right? So, what essentially what you're calling is really to drill down and look deeper and really define your kind of circle of competence and where, with who, what kind of numbers and which companies you want to compare yourself with, right? And
Sure.
find out what makes sense and not just kind of stay in those kind of key KPIs. And because the numbers can be different for individual categories of business, and there is no one number in that sense. I think that's what you are saying.
Yeah, so we have access in EY to we call it the process depot, and it's a lot of benchmarking data from across industry, across sectors. And I often go in and I can pick a number of different sectors and I can look at the benchmarking information, and it always amazes me how different it is.
Mm.
And really, you can kind of take a step back and almost see the kind of the risk appetite of organizations in the public sector versus the private sector, the scale and the size of their procurement departments. Like they're all different. And again, this feeds back to my kind of my statement that if you try and overlay something that was successful in a private sector setting, there's no guarantee that that's going to overlay perfectly into a public sector setting. And if I can give you one more example of that, would be if you decided you had a big tail spend that you wanted to kind of, get some sort of manners on, what happens is that you aggregate, and that's great and that's fine, but you end up then with large contracts, but you don't have anybody to manage these contracts. And what can happen
Yeah.
then is that procurement take on the kind of the role of the de facto contract manager, which I've seen it so many times in organizations I've worked with, in organizations I just from people that I know, that it's a disaster. Because if you're buying goods and services locally from a local service provider, you're effectively managing that relationship locally. That's what you're doing. If I then take that relationship away from you and force you to use a different service provider, you're now going to say, well, look at, I don't vouch for that company. I was very happy using this person. You're going to manage that now. And that's where I think some large purchasing organizations kind of fall down. But ironically, and I can this back to technology, I think this is a bit of an untapped area where Gen AI and machine learning will be able to assist organizations to manage contracts on behalf of organizations. I can imagine, real-time dashboards with a certain set of kind of KPIs and like an SLA that's there. So there's
Yeah,
no real time being invested by the individuals to kind of manage the contracts. They're going to be getting weekly, monthly dashboards. It can even be kind of managed by exception. Only when issues arise does it kind of ping up. And I can see there that is another example of where technology, I think, could be used to benefit the overall procurement function.
for sure. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think you spoke about managing, right? Managing suppliers. Ultimately, end of the day, it's all about working with people. I think one of your posts in the recent past is around procurement as a service, right? You wrote something around PaaS, procurement as a service as offering, and its scope for the future. Uh, do you want to kind of um, spell it out a bit?
Yeah, sure. So like procurement as a service has been around for a long time, but it was only kind of in its infancy maybe 12, 13 years ago. I dabbled a little bit in my former employment, trying to see would there be any way we could bring in maybe a third party service provider to be able to do some of the procurement for us or assist us in it. Now it didn't ultimately go anywhere, but I obviously in my job now have to be keeping myself abreast of what's available within the market,
Yeah.
and every conceivable type of procurement as a service is now available. Tender advisory, running tenders, that service is there, going out and actually getting competitive quotations, dipping into a market where pre-existing rates have been already agreed with third-party service providers. You're buying this a lot of the time as a SaaS. You buy 1, 2, 3 licenses, and that gives you an opportunity to be able to piggyback on and leverage everybody who's using that kind of service. So this is the future as I see it. I think there will always be a objective for organizations, irrespective if it's public or private sector, to be running a lean, inverted commas, procurement function. And I think if you can get some of your procurements through third party service providers, and ensuring that you get the same quality, hopefully better outcomes, I think that's where organizations are going to spend money. Because when I think of organizations, if you think there's like 10 organizations doing similar things, going out with their requirements to the same kind of market participants, it's quite inefficient if you think about it. So if you can have a center of excellence where all this happens centrally, and then all of these 5 companies or 10 companies utilize those services in a service model and a kind of a per license model, that's really where it's at for me.
Yeah, thank you. I think you, um, uh, apart from all this, right, as part of this different engagements, flavors of procurement, um, tools are embedded with it, right? So one of the challenges that I see as procurement practitioner we need to deal with is around adoption. So whether it's part of implementation, new rollouts, or even where systems have been implemented for years, you see there is cross different organization there is lack of adoption. Users are not really invested into the system. So I just wanted to based on your extensive years of experience on the procurement side, and you have done, you have taken up roles really from you grown from really system user into system leader in the past from a business side point of view. So what are your thoughts around system adoption that you see in SAP engagements or any other kind of system implementation engagement as part of your advisory?
Sure. No, it's quite interesting because I've always taken a very kind of a simplistic view to any systems adoption, systems integration. Um, People have to be at the center of anything you do. They have to be. And how often do we see it that a system is agreed that it's going to be implemented, and that there's a kind of a tick in the box exercise done where they ask for maybe 1 or 2 representatives of the business to take part in a couple of preliminary discussions. where their input isn't listened to, and then the system is adopted anyway. That's not how you implement a system. There needs to be proper wholesale business-wide engagement. People taking part in workshops. Every voice is important, because without that, and I've seen it myself firsthand, and I'm sure you've seen it as well, that the best system in the world doesn't land for some reason, and then people are asking why didn't it land all the
Yeah.
time. I'm not sure what the percentage would be. It would be in the high 75, 80%, I would imagine, well, because people weren't put at the center of the journey. What is it that we're trying to do? And I give you actually quite a good practical example of that. When I was working as a purchasing manager in my previous job, I didn't have to buy much for myself, because the nature of my role, I was kind of office space. I didn't have to buy things, maybe the odd bit of stationery or something like that. But I had two new staff members join, and I decided one day that I'd bring them to one of the maintenance depots so they could have a look at the
Mhm.
trains and get a feel for the people and the culture, etc. But I needed to get them some PPE. They needed safety footwear, and they needed a high visibility jacket, and they needed a hard hat. So I decided that I'd have to buy them for them. And that was my first time to interface with the systems that we as a department had put in place. And I couldn't navigate them. And it was a dreadful experience. The user experience was really, really poor. And this was the first hand now me seeing the pain points that everybody else within the business were experiencing. And I realized then, looking back, and I did take a bit of a deep dive as to how we ended up in that system. And really, it was a systems driven initiative without really taking into account any operational difficulties that the end user would have. And that's that misalignment. And I think if you have a system, you hear often people saying that procurement needs to be aligned with the business objectives. That's 100% true. But their systems need to be, you know, easy to use, user friendly, intuitive, not getting in
Yeah.
the way of somebody trying to get their job done. And I found the system to be dreadful with that regard. And I actually made it my business then. I said, for any other system changes that we were bringing in, that we would have a lot more engagement with the end users. We'd set up user groups, because no matter what you're buying, you're always going to have problems in the business from the people who are actually trying to do it. The systems people and the procurement people might be on the same page, but it may not be the page that the end user is on. And I think if you don't have those three elements working in unison, I really do think you end up with suboptimal procurement systems outcomes, which have the kind of the byproduct then of having a kind of a compounding effect, that people start to disengage with procurement, and they see, well, look, at this is just a very, very difficult organization to deal with, and I'm going to do my own thing. And unfortunately, that's what does happen. So I think it's critically important that we all sing from the same hymn sheet, but that the hymn sheet isn't dictated by any one party. It has to be an ongoing conversation.
Yeah. I think one of my take in this case is what I see is there has been a lot of change. I think you are aware. Just SAP as an example, Fiori is one of the main examples. There has been a lot of transitions in the recent past, but and I believe that these systems are more user friendly now than they were ever before. Whereas I also see that from really a business user point of view, that sometimes you see that system kind of affinity is also lacking. Maybe that's a training or really change management challenge. And I believe I think you mentioned about Gen AI, right? And there are tools within, for example, within SAP, there are uh, uh, within in-app guidance, so you can really build step by step, click-based guidance. So if an end user is in the system should guide you where to go next and where to perform your next set of action. So yeah, AI will have a major role to play going forward, and that's what I see as part of the new AI offerings from SAP.
Sure.
I'm sure other organizations, you are more exposed to that. Other organizations are also rapidly ramping up as part of their offering because
Yeah, I've seen a lot of examples of organizations, and a couple of actual use cases of stuff that they've actually implemented using Gen AI, guided buying, kind of that guiding people through the procurement systems to be able to get to where they need to get to. But I always do, somewhere at the back of my mind, think that if we need to implement a guiding process, does that mean that maybe our processes are a little bit inefficient?
Mm,
Um, like in an ideal world, these things will be very, very intuitive. And, if we think back to where we've come from, if somebody wanted to buy, I don't know, that hard hat, that they could go on to some sort of I don't know, a SharePoint catalog, and they could click a button and they could search for hard hat and a couple of pictures would come up and there might be material code there and they could maybe drag that and put it into a requisition, or maybe they might have more of a kind of a punch out catalog type thing.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, that we've gone from there to what, as I see it, is organizations who've got very, very fancy dashboards, kind of, wizards, kind of what they see, kind of a GUI, kind of what the user sees, but you don't necessarily see what's sitting behind that. And if you go onto companies' websites who are, selling procurement tech, it's all about the visual. Isn't this very clever? Isn't this very kind of nice to look at? That should be a minimum. I think it's what sits behind that is what's important, and you don't necessarily get to see or hear more about what sits behind that process. So yeah, I think procurement technology providers have a bit of a piece of work to do to sell the benefits of their system over what currently is out there, because I'm not going to spend lots of money for an incremental improvement in procurement outcomes. I want big return on investment because I am taking on a lot of risk a lot of the time to be able to do this, and I really want a good return on investment there. So that's a bit of a gap as I see it, but there's no doubt about it that like the technologies that are available now are superb. And I think back to even to my category manager days, if I had access to the likes of SAP category management and other kind of real-time data analytics to be able to help me make better decisions, I undoubtedly would have made better decisions. So I think this is a step in the right direction, and I think it's all positive. I just would be conscious of kind of hype that might be out there.
Yeah. No, thank you. I think uh, you you have drawn the distinction between what's simple and what's fancy, right? So I think that's a fundamental questions to ask. If something can be simple, do we really need to make it really fancier? And by doing so, we kind of we might end up adding additional clicks or activities for end users in that sense, right?
Sure.
It might be looking really fancy, but you are not really addressing the core of it, which should be the buying should be simple, for example. So yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think like I said at the beginning of this kind of session, these things really make sense for practitioners, system practitioners like us to when we get acquainted with the system we should keep asking those questions. And when you become part of, you become internal to these kind of companies that right now I'm in my current role, I'm part of the agrochemical company, US based company. It kind of forces me to really ask these kind of questions. So yeah, thank you for kind of
Yeah,
re-emphasizing on that.
if I could add one small piece onto the end of that, and like for me, it's always about asking the better questions. So
Yeah.
anytime there's a proposed change to any system, it's primarily driven from something, isn't it? And if I could
Mm.
give a kind of a hypothetical example of people not following due process, for argument's sake, non-compliant kind of purchasing, that if the decision is taken from the business to stop this, to eradicate it, and they bring in more kind of lengthy bureaucratic systems that people have to follow to stop people doing that, the better question would be to ask the end users in the first instance, why are you circumventing the system? If you're focusing your time and effort on changing your systems to make things not possible,
Yeah.
you're missing the point. The point should be you should be spending all of your time at the front end asking the end users, why are you doing what you're doing? Because that will elicit the proper information that you'll be able to use then to redesign the system to make it work for everybody. And I think that's something that happens regularly enough, to be honest. I think system changes that are driven by the business for some selfish reason is missing out on a glorious opportunity to actually work with the end users to come up with a solution that works for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gary, staying on that system area, I I mentioned about your recent post only yesterday. You spoke about AI and AI offerings, and I think you also raised one or two concerns where things might go, right? So, do you want to touch upon just expand on that post of yours and
Yeah.
just
So
highlight?
yeah, so I would like to think that I would be one of the champions for procurement. I'm very positive about procurement. I love what we do. I love the value we can bring. etc., etc. But I just do, and I have heard it starting to slip into the kind of vocabulary now of procurement and Gen AI about um, more efficiency in the process. And efficiency can mean, one of two things. It can mean lower headcount, or it
Yeah,
can mean a redistribution of people into more value adding activities. And I am yet to be convinced that there's going to be a wholesale move to move people into more value adding activities, only from the basis that they may not have the skill set to be able to do that anyway. I think technology in its own right potentially will assist with those strategic operations as well. And I just would be always very conscious of the narrative that ultimately, and again, if we strip it back, that if my job is to procure goods and services on behalf of the business, and if I'm doing that at the moment with a team of 10 to a certain standard, if you're going to bring in technology and it's going to reduce me down to 7 people, okay, that's fine. But the outcomes have to be equal or better than what I currently do now. Because if they're not, you're sacrificing all of the gains that procurement have made for the purpose of saving a few euro. And I don't think that's really where it's at. And I don't necessarily believe the technology providers, it's not their concern. They will provide the tools. How the end users integrate it and adopt it and what they do with the efficiency savings is up to them. So I think it's a genuine conversation that has to be had. And I think if you're an organization that has, again, 10 procurement people and you're sold a dream of maybe being able to deliver the same amount of value for, 7 people, you would be asking yourself the legitimate question, what sort of an organization am I? Am I the organization that is actually looking to actively reduce headcount? I think organizations will be somewhat reluctant to be looking to be reducing headcounts. And I'm yet to be convinced that procurement outcomes on a tactical basis will be any better through technology, because ultimately you're still buying products from service providers, for modest amounts of money. So it's a concern I would have. I'll be watching the space quite carefully. I would like to think it would be the latter view, that it will be an opportunity for procurement to free up resources from the noisy day-to-day tactical stuff across into the more strategic end of things. But that's not straightforward. That's a kind of a pipe dream, isn't it? There's a lot that has to happen to kind of make that happen. So it's something that I'll be watching carefully, but only from the basis that I'm a big believer in procurement and what we can do. And I just would hate to see that diluted by technology.
absolutely. That again makes a lot of sense, and I don't think it's foreign. We have seen and we see there are a lot of churn happening really from a headcount point of view, right? Across, I think, US market, and especially on the tech companies, you see uh, the customer service going down because there is not many people around. It
Sure.
just bots or web assistants performing that activity. Then the quality really drastically goes down in terms of customer service offering, and that can really creep into procurement, other areas, accounts payable, and so many other areas, just like you mentioned. So yeah, that's again a great point, and yeah, people should look into that, and hopefully the I think the end goal is to really maintain the quality and build upon it, go forward and not really go backwards.
No, I
Uh,
fully, I fully agree. I fully agree.
Thank you, Gary. I think just on that, because ultimately, I think you mentioned you are a champion of really, procurement improvement, procurement excellence. One of your posts in the recent past was about how the secret to run complex procurement process. You mentioned around 4, 5 points there. Do you want to quickly summarize that post and just give it a high level overview of that?
Yeah, no, sure. So when I started in procurement, I had a great mentor. I think I've said this multiple times before to people, that a person who was genuinely interested in me, who was extremely knowledgeable. But the most important part is that he saw it as his objective to impart his knowledge to me. And with that in mind, he started me off slow in procurement. He had me creating purchase orders. He had me going off getting quotations. And over the years, we built up to a stage where he felt comfortable that I was ready to move into the next chapter of my career, which is the more complicated procurements. Up to the stage that when he ultimately retired from it, the job, and I ended up doing his job, and I ended up doing the most complex procurements that are out there. And I think anybody who would have purchased trains before will realize that it's quite a complex kind of market for a number of reasons. So if you would have asked me on day one when I started procurement, would I be able to run a contract for buying trains? Absolutely not. It took me a while to get to the stage where I had the kind of the familiarity and the competence to be able to work across a number of things. But one thing I have noticed is that there's people working in procurement who are only given the kind of standard procurements to run, and that must be very boring and must be very kind of not really challenging. And I have spoken to people before, and they say to me, "I'm not ready for doing those complex tenders." And the point is that they don't realize they are. But it's running a complex procurement process is no real different than a fairly straightforward procurement process, as far as I'm concerned. Is there more money involved? Well, yes, there is. But I was buying trains and I was buying 250 trains. But that's only a numbers game. If I had stripped that back and said, I'm only buying one train, but I'm buying 250 of them and focusing on that one particular area, straight
Mm.
away a multi like a 400 million contract is now distilled down to maybe a 3 million euro contract. And then if you start thinking in those kind of basis, you really can't go too far wrong. So I think that everybody has the ability to be able to run complex tenders. I just think sometimes there's a bit of mystique and a little bit of a fear factor there about them. There's definitely nuances. There's definitely the stakes are higher. There's more risk involved. I get all of that stuff, but fundamentally, it's using the same building blocks that you have for your standard contracts. And what I'm trying to do as part of this message is kind of build the next generation of procurement leaders. There's a lot of very, very talented people out there, but they might just feel that they are comfortable doing what they're doing, but they don't want to make the next step up to the next level of kind of complexity. And I challenge that kind of mindset. I think everybody has the ability to be superb at procurement if they just do the simple things right and they really commit and care about what it is that they're trying to achieve. The big takeaway for me was that, and I've said this to everybody about every procurement process, I fundamentally care about the outcome of that process. I really, really do. And what I want to do is make sure that I get the best outcome from the procurement process. So everything I do is kind of channeling towards that. Do I look at risk? I do. I look at risk from all angles. Do I make sure that all stakeholders involved? I absolutely do. Am I keeping finance advised as to what the potential cash outflow will be over the life of the agreement? Absolutely. Am I dealing with my insurance people? Am I dealing with my legal people? All of this kind of good stuff, but all with the objective of coming up with the best outcome. And I would like to think that, when I retire at some stage, people will look back and say the procurement outcomes that Gary Mander delivered were best in class. That's what I would hope. And I think if you come from that perspective, I think you really can't go far wrong. But I do really want to emphasize again that everybody has the ability to award, multi-million euro contracts. They just need to believe in themselves and apply the tools in a very standardized manner.
Thank you. And a lot of this makes sense for the next question that I wanted to ask. That do you have any kind of advice for beginners who want to start on the procurement process or even in the procurement system side? I think a lot of these hold true for those folks, right? Collaboration, looking into all aspects of the process, ensuring that you are doing the due diligence. But do you have any kind of do you want to add to that for beginners who want to kind of start their career either on the procurement kind of process side as a user or practitioner versus who are on the system side,
Sure.
SAP or
That's a really,
any other
yeah,
system?
that's a really, really good question now, I have to say. And like it is something that I am quite passionate about as well. So best advice that I could give anybody is that when you end up in a procurement role, for the first while, you're going to be doing a task effectively. And that task could be,
Yeah.
I don't know, it could be getting quotations, as I said, or creating purchase orders. But what you need to be doing in the background is taking a big, big, big step backwards and seeing where does that little activity fit in the broader scale of things.
End to end.
Because I think
Yeah.
people can get too focused in on the kind of the micro, but really they need to take a kind of a step back and look at the macro. And I mean from the macro, from the perspective of understanding the pain points of contract managers at the far end and almost then taking the full 360 to the far end of the process, where it's kind of the demand, where does demand come from, who's estimating the demand, and you need to do that on your own time. You need to be genuinely interested in the overall end-to-end procurement process. Even, I don't know, accounts payable, invoice posting, goods receipts, the stuff that people might think it's very kind of mundane and very boring. It might be from a tactical perspective, but if you take a step back and see where that fits into the overall perspective, you'll get a far more enjoyable procurement experience. And that's something that I did. Um, You can control that. Other things you can't control. Having a great mentor, like I said, it's a luxury. Anybody out there who has a good mentor, count your lucky stars, because not everybody is
Definitely.
in the same sort of position. If you
Yeah.
have the luxury to move jobs and you can find somebody who is a good procurement mentor, it'll be the best investment you will ever make. I can't really kind of stress that kind of highly enough. But I think all of that can be distilled down into one thing. You have to really enjoy and care about what you're doing. Procurement isn't just a means to an end. It's far bigger than that. It's such a valuable, important, value-adding function that the world is your oyster if you come into procurement, but you have to really make the most of it, and you have to kind of take those chances. Um, you know, invest in yourself, and get guidance from external, do kind of qualifications, training, all of these kind of good things to become the best procurement person you can be. I think if you stick to the day to day, you'll get bored very, very quickly. And I do feel ultimately that's why procurement still has a staff turnover issue. I think that people aren't given access to the variety of activities to keep them
Mm.
interested. I think people are just seen as a subject matter expert in a very, very niche, small field. And I think that's a bit of a zero-sum game.
Thank you, Eric. That makes a lot of sense. I have just two last few questions, couple of questions. I think one is around one of your kind of passion area, as I mentioned, is the procurement laws, right, regulations. There are a lot of recent changes in EU, and recently we see there are a lot of US, China. There are a lot of trade rules and regulation changes coming out from US. How do you see these things, these trends emerging, and the kind of impact that will have in the procurement space?
Yeah, it's something that is kind of close to my heart. So it is sectoral specific. So obviously we've had the discussion about rolling stock medical devices. There's a lot of areas where the EU are now looking at third countries and seeing about state aid rules. So it is changing the fabric of procurement, if you like, and supply chains more generally. So if you happen to be working in an organization and you're head of procurement or a chief procurement officer, you need to understand your supply chain. If you don't, you're exposing yourself to potentially massive, massive risk that's there. So where is all this information going to come from? Well, again, I think technology is definitely going to kind of aid that transition. If it's CSRD, whatever the case may be, if it's anything to do with kind of sustainability more generally, and kind of forced labor requirements, etc., etc. But procurement has fundamentally changed, I think. And I think the days of just going out to tender and awarding contracts to supplier A, you need to have a proper due diligence process about supplier A, and it's not a snapshot in time. It needs to be an ongoing kind of dialogue that's there, because if you're over leveraged with one supplier, they could be okay today, but you don't know what's going to be like in 12, 18 months time. And if you're
Yeah.
over leveraged and have all of your eggs in one basket and something like that happens, that's a huge business risk to the organization. And I'd even go as far as to say that any organization that doesn't have an amount of procurement risk on their corporate procurement risk register is really, really exposing themselves to the uncertainty that's kind of out there. So yeah, it's very, very rapidly changing. I do keep an eye on everything that's going on at the EU level. It started off quite subtle, but now it's becoming real, and you're now
Mm.
starting to see, well, do I really understand my supply chain? Do I really understand my tier two suppliers? Do I trust my tier one suppliers to be able to manage their tier two suppliers kind of
Yeah.
accordingly? Obviously all the kind of net zero ambitions as well feeds into that. So there's an awful lot going on, which, let's be honest about it, is new to procurement. This was never part of the procurement landscape up to maybe 5 years ago. And if I ask the question honestly, how many procurement departments have grown commensurate with the additional responsibilities? Very few. So this is now an instance where people are now trying to do more with the same resources that they have. And the more that they're trying to do is actually quite important when you think about it. So again, I would be the procurement champion here. I would be saying nobody better to police this whole element of procurement, but just give us the resources and give us the budget that we can go out and procure the type of technology that we need to be able to manage this professionally for the organization.
Absolutely. Um, just to end, right, Gary, where does technology and systems really fit in all these kind of conversation? I think you touched upon the system and how systems should behave in that sense throughout this conversation. But if you just want to summarize, where do you see the procurement landscapes going? And if you can also touch upon the best of breed versus the the big suite providers. I
Sure.
think at least on LinkedIn, I see there a lot of conversation, and sometimes people taking pot shots at each other. But I just feel that it's not one against another, but like it's a combination of both. But where do you see these things going? Because now the risks are more than ever, the regulations are tighter than ever, right? And the demand even from really from public, right, from people, the taxpayers are more than ever. So how do you see this kind of technology landscape moving, and
Sure.
your thoughts on
So
everything?
yeah, so like there's two parts of that question. So I'll deal with the kind of technology piece first. So it kind of to me boils down to the scales of operations. Like I know some very, very large organizations that only have 7 suppliers, right? That might sound strange, but it's
Mm,
just the way that their manufacturing operations are. The companies who they deal with have been dealing with for, decades. They've really, really deep embedded relationships there with these organizations. But they need to manage these suppliers in the same way as a company who has 500 suppliers. It's easier for them to do. They
mm,
might decide to do that manually. They might decide to engage with, I don't know, a third party service provider who does supplier audits. They go in once a year, they do their audits, they come back and give audit reports back into the organization. It's either a kind of a green, amber, red type kind of situation. And they can manage that as best as they can, and that's
yeah,
fine. But not every organization is like that. And a lot of organizations are far more nebulous. There's far more kind of moving parts to organizations. They're sourcing products from Far East, kind of Asia, kind of areas where they don't have that kind of, they can't just turn up on the supplier's door and ask to
yeah,
look around their kind of factory. So it's more complicated for them. I think if you try and manually do that with spreadsheets and stuff like that, no, it's just not going to work because the stakes are so high. That's the reality. So like a lot of the big organizations, SAP, ServiceNow, Microsoft, they all have their own ESG reporting platforms that can be used. That is the future, to be honest. I think it is because I think that this isn't just a snapshot in time. This isn't something that everybody's been encouraged to do now. And once it's done, it doesn't have to be done again. This is around forever now. This is going to be part of the fabric of procurement for forever. And I think that companies are going to start having to invest in that. Now we come down to the best in class type kind of best in breed type discussion. Again, it is quite interesting because a lot of these kind of enterprise level solutions would say they've an awful lot of functionality and they've an awful lot of functionality that maybe not every organization will need on day one.
makes sense. Yeah.
So what you need to kind of do, and again, I think I said it at the very, very start, is that if the discussion point with a client for me is we're looking at ESG platforms, for argument's sake, I have a long journey to go with that client to be able to get to the stage where I can advise them on the best solution for them.
Mm,
It may be best in breed, it may be best, it may be something quite niche, but we will get there along that kind of journey. So all of the third party service providers look at their businesses, they're trying to earn money. That's how they kind of operate. They're trying to in some instances have a all singing, all dancing, one size fits all platform that will be able to be universally overlapped over different organizations. But I think if we go back to my original conversation about how there is no best in class. All organizations are different. The structure of their supply chains, the number of suppliers that they have, where they're geographically located, how important they are to organizations. I don't think it would be right to say that you could pick up a product and just overlay it immediately
yeah.
onto an organization. So I think there's a journey that has to be traveled with the end users, with the people, putting people at the center, and then working very closely with the systems people to see how easy would it be implementing, product A over kind of product B. So it's an area that I'm actually quite interested in at the moment. Obviously, I have to advise clients on the best type of tech and maybe design a kind of a roadmap. But a lot of organizations who are in the kind of the consulting space have designated technology consulting partners. That's what their
Cool.
core role is.
Yeah.
I'm business consulting. They'll all have kind of transformation delivery kind of arms as well. So I think the organizations have the full suite of capabilities to be able to do what an organization needs them to do, but it's a journey before you can get to the stage where you decide that's what we need. And I think if somebody at a CFO level decides one day they want to implement product X without really understanding the implications for the business, I think that would be a bad business decision.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Gary. I think there is a lot we can talk to because of your vast experience in all across different areas of procurement. But for today, I think what we have covered should make a good kind of fundamental foundation for people, whether you are a system practitioner or a process focused person. This should give a lot of insight and at least thought provoking ideas to start exploring more. So again, thank you for your time, and I look forward to interacting with you more and more in the future.
No, as I said, listen, thank you for the opportunity to speak. And if any of your listeners want some free advice, if they want to just drop me a DM on LinkedIn and just ask me my thoughts on something, I'm more than happy to
Absolutely.
set up a call with them, just have a kind of a chat to be able to give them a bit of an initial kind of feeling for whatever topic it is that's kind of on their mind.
Indeed. And when I share this, I'll of course tag you. I'll share your LinkedIn profile so that it should be easier for people to go to your profile, read through your write ups, and reach out to you if they need to.
Great.
Thank you so
Thank you very
much.
much.